How do you measure a life? Not in years, not in breaths drawn or heartbeats counted, but in the quiet spaces between actions. The moments when you choose someone else's need over your own desire, when you swallow your exhaustion to offer comfort, when you fold your dreams into neat squares and tuck them away in a drawer labeled someday. Elara measured her life this way. In teaspoons of sugar stirred into tea for a feverish child at 3 in the morning. In the gentle pressure of her hands kneading dough while her own stomach growled with hunger. In the soft hum of a lullaby sung to soothe a frightened soul, her voice growing hoarse long before the fear subsided. She gave not in grand gestures that would be remembered in speeches or etched on plaques, but in the thousand invisible threads of daily devotion that hold a family together, threads so fine they become invisible, so essential they are mistaken for air itself. And like air, no one notices until it is gone. She was 23 when she first understood the weight of giving everything. Not the romantic, sweeping sacrifice of novels, but the slow, grinding surrender of self that happens in hospital corridors under fluorescent lights that bleach color from skin and hope from eyes. Her mother had collapsed in the grocery store, a bag of apples rolling across linoleum like accusations. The diagnosis was swift and brutal. Early-onset dementia, the doctor said, his voice carefully neutral. A thief in the house of the mind, he might have added, though he did not. Elara stood in that sterile room, the scent of antiseptic burning her nostrils, and watched her mother's hands that had braided her hair, kneaded bread, held hers during thunderstorms, tremble uncontrollably on the starched white sheet. Her father, a man built of quiet stoicism and calloused hands, stood by the window, his shoulders slumped as if the sky itself had settled upon them. He turned to Elara, his eyes hollowed out by a grief too new to name, and said only, "What will we do?" And in that moment, with no fanfare, no consultation, no consideration of the life she had been building, a modest apartment with sunflowers on the fire escape, a job at the library where she was learning to restore old books, a man named Daniel who kissed her like she was something sacred, Elara made her choice. She moved back into her childhood home, a small bungalow with peeling paint and memories clinging to every wall like dust motes in afternoon light. She told Daniel it would be temporary. 6 months, she said. Until we figure things out. He waited 4 months before he stopped calling. She understood. How could she ask him to wait for a ghost when she herself was disappearing? The forgetting began not with malice but with necessity. Someone had to manage the medications, the appointments, the slow unraveling of a woman who sometimes mistook her daughter for her own long-dead sister. Someone had to learn the language of decline, the way a furrowed brow meant pain, not confusion, the way a sudden stillness signaled the approach of a panic that would leave her mother sobbing in corners, convinced strangers had stolen her children. Elara became fluent in this dialect of loss. She learned to bathe a woman who shrank from touch, to coax food past lips that had forgotten how to chew, to hold a trembling body through night terrors that left them both drenched in sweat and sorrow by dawn. Her father retreated into the garage, into the silent companionship of tools and half-finished projects, emerging only for meals he ate in silence before retreating again. He wasn't cruel. He was drowning. And Elara, treading water beside him, made the choice to be the buoy for them both. She took a job as a home health aide during the day, ironic she sometimes thought, being paid to care for strangers while caring for her mother for free, and came home to her second shift. Her hands, once delicate enough to handle fragile first editions, grew rough and chapped. The scent of lavender hand cream she'd once loved was replaced by the medicinal smell of antiseptic wipes and the faint, sweet odor of decay that no amount of cleaning could fully erase. She stopped looking in mirrors. What was there to see? A woman becoming transparent, her features blurred by exhaustion, her identity dissolving into the role of caregiver until the two were indistinguishable. Years folded into one another like pages stuck together by humidity. Her mother's decline was not a straight line but a series of plateaus and sudden drops, each one stealing another piece of the woman she had been. First went the recipes she'd carried in her head for 50 years, how much cinnamon for the apple cake, the precise moment to pull the bread from the oven. Then the names of neighbors, then friends, then finally, on a Tuesday afternoon while sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, she looked at Elara and whispered, "Where is my daughter?" She was just here. Elara's breath caught, a sharp hook in her throat. She forced a smile, poured a glass of water and said, "I'm right here, Mama." But the woman in the chair only blinked, her eyes clouded with a confusion so profound it seemed to have its own weather system. In that moment, Elara understood the cruelest truth of dementia. It doesn't just steal memory from the one afflicted. It steals recognition from the one who remains. It erases the witness. You become a stranger holding the hand of someone who loved you into existence, and the love has nowhere to land. It hangs in the air between you, a ghost of connection, until even that dissipates. Her father died quietly in his sleep 2 years later, his heart simply stopping as if it had decided it had carried enough. Ilara found him in the morning, still in his recliner, a book open on his lap. The funeral was small. Aunts and uncles she barely knew patted her hand and said variations of, "You've been so strong," and "Your mother would be proud if she understood," not realizing the second clause undid the first. After the casserole stopped arriving and the phone stopped ringing, Ilara was alone with her mother in the too-quiet house. The weight of it pressed down on her, not just the physical labor of full-time care, but the emotional gravity of being the sole keeper of a shared history that was evaporating day by day. She began talking to her mother as if narrating their lives. "Remember when I was 7 and fell out of the oak tree? You held me so tight I couldn't breathe, but I didn't care because your heart was beating against my ear like a drum saying you're safe, you're safe, you're safe." Her mother would sometimes smile faintly, a reflex without context. Other times she would stare through Ilara as if she were made of glass. Ilara kept talking anyway. She was building an arc of words to carry them both across the flood of forgetting. She didn't know then that arcs need passengers who remember the shore they left behind. When her mother passed, gently in her sleep, her breathing simply ceasing like a sentence ending without punctuation, Ilara felt not relief, not freedom, but a terrifying vertigo. For 17 years, her entire existence had orbited one fragile human being. Every decision, every hour, every ounce of energy had been calibrated to meet that single need. Now the center was gone. The orbit collapsed. She stood in the empty house, the silence so profound it had texture, weight, a presence that filled every room. She wandered from space to space, the kitchen where she'd prepared thousands of meals, the living room where she'd sat through countless episodes of game shows her mother no longer understood but found comforting in their predictable rhythms, the bedroom where she'd changed sheets stained with the evidence of bodily failure. Each room was a museum of sacrifice, but the exhibits had no labels. Who would know that the faint scar on her forearm came from grabbing a hot pan her mother had forgotten on the stove? Who would understand that the particular way she folded towels, edges perfectly aligned, was a skill honed over years of creating order in a world that was disintegrating? The evidence of her giving was everywhere, but it was written in a language only she could read, and soon even she would begin to forget the grammar. The first visitors came within days. Her brother, Mark, flew in from Colorado with his wife and 2 children. He hugged her tightly at the door, his cologne smelling of pine and expensive whiskey. "You did it, Lara," he said, using the childhood nickname she hadn't heard in decades. "You got her through." The words should have been a bomb. Instead they felt like an erasure. Got her through, to where? To this emptiness? To this silence? But she nodded, accepted the praise, made coffee for everyone. Her niece, 10 years old with braces and a smartphone permanently attached to her hand, wandered into the living room and wrinkled her nose. "It smells old in here," she announced. No one corrected her. They spent 3 days sorting through belongings, boxing up a lifetime with the efficiency of people who had not lived it. Mark held up a faded photograph of their mother holding a toddler Ilara. "Remember this?" he asked his sister. Ilara's throat tightened. She remembered the day perfectly, the picnic, the way her mother had sung to her, the strawberry ice cream dripping down her chin. But she simply nodded. What was the point of saying, "I remember how the sun felt on my shoulders," how her voice cracked on the high note of the song, how I thought in that moment that happiness was a place you could live forever? Her memories were not currency here. They were artifacts with no market value. On the last evening, as Mark packed his suitcase, he sat at the kitchen table with Ilara. "So what now?" he asked not unkindly. "You can't stay here forever. Place is too big for one person. And honestly it's not worth much. Neighborhood's gone downhill." He outlined a plan he'd clearly been formulating during his brief visit. Sell the house quickly, split the modest proceeds, encourage Ilara to move to a smaller apartment closer to him where she could start over. He used that phrase 3 times, start over, as if her previous 40 years had been a rough draft to be crumpled and discarded. He didn't ask what she wanted. He didn't ask if she had savings, she didn't. Every extra dollar had gone to medications not covered by insurance, to special mattresses, to caregivers on the rare days she'd allowed herself to collapse. He didn't ask if she had friends nearby, she didn't. Friendships require reciprocity, and she had long ago stopped having anything to give in return. He simply assumed that after 17 years of total immersion in another's decline, she would be ready to step onto dry land and walk away without looking back. As he spoke, Ilara watched his hands that had held their mothers only during brief holiday visits, hands that had never changed an adult diaper or calmed a midnight terror, hands that had built a successful career in software development while she built nothing but a fortress of care around a dying woman. She felt no resentment. That would come later, slowly, like a bruise forming beneath the skin. In that moment, she felt only a profound disconnect, as if they were speaking different languages and neither realized it. After they left, the house felt different. Not just empty but provisional. A stage after the actors have departed, the props waiting to be struck. Ilara walked through the rooms and saw not memories but inventory. The floral sofa where she'd sat holding her mother's hand during seizures was just furniture. The kitchen table where she'd spread out pill organizers each Sunday was just wood and varnish. The bed where her mother had taken her last breath was just a bed. The meaning had been stripped away, replaced by the cold calculus of estate settlement. She tried to sleep in her old room, but the silence pressed against her eardrums like water. She found herself standing in doorways in the middle of the night, listening for the soft shuffle of slippers, the murmur of confusion that had been the soundtrack of her adult life. The absence was louder than any sound had ever been. The sale happened faster than she expected. Mark handled everything remotely, his efficiency both impressive and devastating. Within 6 weeks, a young couple with a golden retriever and dreams of renovation had signed the papers. Ilara packed her belongings into 4 cardboard boxes. Clothes, books, a few photographs, the small wooden bird her mother had carved for her when she was 6. Everything else, the furniture, the dishes, the accumulated detritus of 2 generations, was donated or discarded without ceremony. On moving day, she stood on the sidewalk as the couple carried in a sleek leather sofa, their laughter ringing through the open front door. The woman paused, holding a potted fern, and smiled at Ilara. "We're going to love it here," she said brightly. Ilara nodded, unable to speak. She wanted to say, "My mother learned to walk on these floorboards. I kissed my first boyfriend on that porch. My father cried in that kitchen when he got the diagnosis. This house held us as we fell apart." But the words stuck in her throat. What right did she have to burden strangers with grief they hadn't earned? She got into the taxi Mark had arranged, and as it pulled away, she didn't look back. Some goodbyes are too heavy to witness. The apartment Mark found for her was clean, modern, and utterly soulless. White walls, beige carpet, a kitchen with stainless steel appliances that reflected nothing back but her own hollowed-out face. It smelled of new paint and emptiness. He helped her unpack the boxes, arranging her few possessions with a cheerful efficiency that felt like violence. "See? Fresh start," he said, stepping back to admire his work. A single bookshelf with novels spine out, a bed made with crisp white sheets, a small table by the window where she could drink her morning coffee and watch the world go by. He stayed for dinner at a nearby restaurant, talking mostly about his kids' soccer schedules and a promotion he was expecting. He asked once, "How are you holding up?" And when she said, "I'm adjusting," he accepted it as truth. Before he left to catch his flight back to Colorado, he hugged her tightly. "Call if you need anything," he said. And she knew he meant it. But need is a language with many dialects, and the one she spoke now, this raw, formless ache of purposelessness, had no words he would recognize. The first month was a study in stillness. She woke each morning at 5:30, her body still calibrated to the rhythms of care. The time her mother would stir, the time medications needed to be given, the time to begin the slow, patient work of helping a frail body move from bed to chair to bathroom. With no one to care for, the hours stretched before her like a desert with no landmarks. She tried to fill them. She walked to the grocery store and stood paralyzed before shelves of cereal, unable to choose because for 17 years every food decision had been made with one consideration only: what her mother could chew, digest, tolerate. She bought oatmeal because it seemed safest. She tried reading but found her concentration shattered. Her mind, trained for decades to monitor subtle changes in breathing, mood, skin color, could not settle into the sustained attention a novel required. She would read the same paragraph 3 times, the words sliding off her consciousness like water on glass. She attempted to volunteer at the local library, drawn back to the world of books that had once been her sanctuary. But when a patron asked for help finding a specific edition of a 19th-century novel, her mind went blank. The knowledge was still there, buried deep, but the pathways to access it had been paved over by years of prioritizing more urgent information. The side effects of donepezil, the phone number for the home health agency, the precise angle to position a body to prevent bedsores. The librarian, a kind woman named Susan who had once been her colleague, covered for her smoothly, but Ilara saw the flicker of concern in her eyes. She didn't return the following week. The loneliness was not the absence of people. It was the absence of purpose. For 17 years, her existence had been necessary. Not appreciated, not celebrated, but necessary in the most fundamental biological sense. A body requiring care would suffer or die without her intervention. That necessity had been her anchor. Now the anchor was gone, and she was adrift in a sea of hours with no shore in sight. She began sleeping during the day, the curtains drawn against a sun that felt accusatory in its insistence on continuing to rise. She stopped answering the phone after the third time Mark called, and she found herself unable to form sentences beyond monosyllabic replies. He began texting instead, short, cheerful messages about his children's achievements, links to articles he thought she'd enjoy, occasional check-ins that always ended with, "How are you?" She never answered those last questions. What could she say? I am a room that has been emptied of everything except the echo of what used to be here. I am a verb with no object. I gave and gave and gave until there was nothing left to give, and now I do not know how to be. One afternoon, sorting through one of her boxes for something to occupy her hands, she found a small photo album she'd forgotten she owned. It contained pictures from her early 20s, the sunflower on her fire escape, Daniel laughing as he tried to cook pasta and set off the smoke alarm, her mother healthy and vibrant at a family barbecue, her arms around Alara's shoulders, both of them squinting into the sun with genuine joy. She sat on the floor of her sterile apartment and turned the pages slowly, her fingers tracing the faces of people who seemed to belong to another lifetime, another person. The woman in these photos, bright-eyed, shoulders back, a future stretching before her like an open road, was a stranger. Had she really believed those things were possible? A career restoring books. A life with Daniel. Travel to Italy to see the places she'd only read about. Children of her own, perhaps. She closed the album and placed it back in the box, sealing the tape with a firm press of her palm. Some memories are not comforts. They are indictments. The first real crack appeared on a Tuesday. She was standing in her kitchen, staring at the microwave as it counted down 30 seconds for a cup of tea, a ritual she performed 10 times a day not because she wanted tea, but because it gave her hands something to do. The digital numbers flipped from 03 to 02 to 01 to 00 with mechanical indifference. And suddenly, without warning, she was back in her mother's kitchen 17 years earlier, watching the same countdown on a different microwave, her hands shaking as she waited for the water to heat for instant soup because her mother had refused to eat anything else for 3 days and the doctor had said she needed calories, just calories, anything. The memory was not gentle. It was a physical assault. The smell of chicken broth, the weight of exhaustion in her bones, the metallic taste of fear in her mouth, the crushing certainty that she was failing, that she was not enough, that no matter how much she gave it would never be sufficient to hold back the tide of decay. She gasped, stumbling back from the counter as if struck. The microwave beeped its cheerful completion song. The present rushed back in, the clean white counter, the uncluttered space, the silence. But the past had left its fingerprint on the moment. She sank to the floor, her back against the cabinet, and for the first time since her mother's death, she cried. Not the quiet, controlled tears she'd shed during vigils at the hospital bed, but great, heaving sobs that tore from a place so deep inside her she hadn't known it existed. She cried for the girl with sunflowers on her fire escape. She cried for the woman who had given everything and received nothing in return but this echoing emptiness. She cried because she finally understood the terrible equation of her life. She had traded a future for a past and now both were gone. When the tears subsided, leaving her hollowed out and raw, something shifted. Not healing, that would take years she didn't yet know she would have to endure, but a dawning awareness. The forgetting had already begun, and it wasn't being done to her by others. It was being done by time itself, by the relentless forward motion of a world that had no use for grief that did not perform itself prettily and then conclude on schedule. Her brother would forget the exact shade of their mother's eyes. Her niece would grow up with only the vaguest notion of the grandmother who had once existed. The new owners of the house would paint over the faint pencil marks on the doorframe where Alara's father had measured his children's heights each birthday. The world would continue, efficient and unsentimental, sanding down the rough edges of loss until they were smooth enough to ignore. And she would be expected to do the same, to sand herself down, to become smooth and uncomplicated, to stop carrying the weight of 17 years of devotion as if it were nothing more than a minor inconvenience to be overcome with positive thinking and a new hobby. But she couldn't. The weight was in her bones now. It had reshaped her skeleton, rewired her nervous system. She had given everything not as a transaction expecting gratitude in return, that would have been a simpler, cleaner kind of pain, but as an expression of love so total it had become her very metabolism. And love that has nowhere to go does not simply evaporate. It curdles. It turns inward. It becomes a stone in the stomach, a constant companion of absence. She stood up slowly, her joints protesting. She walked to the window and drew back the curtain. Outside, people moved with purpose. Walking dogs, carrying groceries, laughing with friends. Lives being lived. She watched them for a long time, not with envy but with a strange, detached curiosity. How did they do it? How did they carry their own weights without collapsing? Did they even know they were carrying anything at all? Or was the burden of memory, of sacrifice, of love that outlives its object a uniquely female affliction, passed down through generations like an heirloom no one wants but everyone inherits? She didn't know the answer. But as dusk settled over the city, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, she made a decision so small it barely qualified as action. She would not draw the curtains tomorrow morning. She would let the sun in. She would face the day not as something to be endured, but as something to be witnessed. It was not hope. That was too grand a word for the fragile filament glowing inside her chest. It was simply a refusal to disappear completely. To be forgotten by others was one thing. To participate in her own erasure would be the final, unforgivable betrayal, not of those who had forgotten her, but of the woman who had given everything, who had believed in her deepest heart that love was its own reward. She didn't know then that the real forgetting was yet to come. That the world has a particular cruelty for women who have spent their lives in service. It not only takes their youth, their dreams, their bodies, but then acts as if those sacrifices never happened, as if the cared for simply healed themselves, as if the family simply held together through its own inherent strength. She didn't know that in 5 years' time at a family gathering, her niece would ask who the woman was in an old photograph, and Mark would say vaguely, "Oh, that was Mom's helper for a while. A nice lady. Can't remember her name." She didn't know that her own existence would become a footnote in someone else's story, then a blank space where a footnote once was. But on this evening, standing at the window as darkness gathered outside, she knew only this: she had given everything. They had forgotten her. And yet, she was still here. Breathing. Feeling the cool glass against her palm. Watching the first star appear in the violet sky. The fact of her continued existence was not a victory. It was not even a comfort. But it was a fact. And facts, however painful, are the only ground we have to stand on when everything else has been washed away. She would stand on this ground. She would learn its contours. She would wait to see what, if anything, might grow in this barren soil. The giving was over. The forgetting had begun. But the being, this fragile, persistent, unacknowledged being, remained. And for now, for this one evening, that would have to be enough. The sun came the next morning not as a gentle invitation but as an intrusion, a blade of gold slicing through the gap in the curtains she had deliberately left open. Ilara woke not to an alarm but to light itself, pooling on the beige carpet like spilled honey. For 17 years, dawn had been a signal of duty, the soft groan of floorboards as she rose to check on her mother, the ritual of pill organizers and blood pressure cuffs, the careful calculation of how much sleep she could afford to lose before her own body would begin to fail her. Now the light held no command. It simply was. And in that simple being, it asked a question she had no language to answer. What do you do with a day that belongs entirely to you? She did not rise immediately. She lay still, watching dust motes dance in the sunbeam, each one a tiny universe catching fire for a moment before drifting back into shadow. Her body felt foreign, not just stiff from sleep, but rearranged as if her bones had shifted during the night to accommodate this new reality of unstructured time. She flexed her fingers, watching the tendons move beneath skin mapped with faint scars and calluses earned in service to another's fragility. These hands had held up a world. Now they rested on a generic duvet in a generic apartment, and the contrast was so stark it stole her breath. She thought of all the hands throughout history that had done the same work hers had done, washing bodies that could no longer wash themselves, spooning food into mouths that had forgotten how to chew, wiping away tears from faces that no longer recognized their own children. Millions of women, their labor forming the invisible architecture of civilization, their names lost to time, their sacrifices absorbed into the smooth narrative of families that persevered, or got through difficult times. No monuments to the midnight vigils. No plaques honoring the women who gave up careers, lovers, dreams of travel or creation or selfhood to become the steady ground beneath someone else's collapse. Their reward was not gratitude, that fleeting currency, but erasure. The ultimate success of caregiving was to make the cared for's survival seem inevitable, natural, as if it had happened without intervention. She had succeeded too well. Her mother had lived 17 years beyond prognosis. The family had not fractured under the strain. And therefore, by the cruel mathematics of memory, her 17 years of sacrifice became mathematically unnecessary, subtracted from the equation as if they had never been added in the first place. She rose finally, her joints protesting with a symphony of small aches that had become so constant she'd stopped noticing them until moments like this, when stillness made them audible. In the bathroom mirror, a woman she almost recognized stared back. Not the ghost she'd become during the worst years of her mother's decline, that hollowed-out creature with shadows pooled beneath her eyes like spilled ink, but not the vibrant young woman in the photo album either. This face was something in between, weathered but not broken, tired but not defeated, the lines around her eyes speaking not of laughter alone but of countless nights spent straining to hear a faint breath in the dark, to distinguish sleep from something more final. She ran the tap and splashed cold water on her face, the shock of it pulling her fully into the present. Today she decided she would walk. Not with purpose, not toward a store or a pharmacy or a doctor's office, but simply to move through space without destination. It felt like a radical act. The neighborhood was unfamiliar in the daylight. During her first weeks in the apartment, she'd only ventured out after dusk, when the world felt less demanding, less expectant. Now she saw it clearly: modest single-family homes with carefully tended lawns, a park with a rusting swing set, a convenience store with a flickering neon sign. Ordinary. Unremarkable. And in its ordinariness, it held a strange comfort. Nothing here knew her story. No one would look at her and see the caregiver, the daughter who stayed, the woman who sacrificed. She was anonymous. For the first time in decades, she could move through the world without carrying the weight of others' expectations or gratitude or pity. She walked without direction, her feet finding a rhythm that slowly loosened the knots in her shoulders. She passed a woman pushing a stroller, a man walking a dog, teenagers clustered on a corner laughing about something she couldn't hear. Lives in motion. She felt no envy, only a quiet wonder at their unself-consciousness, the way they occupied their bodies without apology, without the constant calculation of how their energy might be redirected toward another's need. She found herself at the edge of the park, where a bench faced a small pond dotted with ducks. Without thinking she sat. The wood was cool beneath her palms. A breeze carried the scent of cut grass and distant rain. And then it happened, the second crack. Not a memory this time, but an absence so profound it had its own presence. She was sitting on a bench in a park on a Tuesday morning with nowhere to be and no one depending on her, and the sheer impossibility of this moment crashed over her like a wave. For 17 years, every minute of her life had been mortgaged to another's survival. Every cup of tea delayed because a body needed turning. Every book abandoned mid-sentence because a cry of confusion echoed from another room. Every dream deferred because sleep was a luxury she could not afford. She had lived in a state of perpetual emergency, her nervous system calibrated to crisis, her identity forged in the fire of necessity. And now the emergency was over. The fire had burned down to ash. And she was left standing in the scorched earth of her own life, not knowing how to build anything new from the ruins. Tears came again, but quieter this time, not the violent sobbing of the kitchen floor, but a slow, steady leaking of grief that seemed to have no source and no end. She did not wipe them away. She let them fall onto her hands, onto the knees of her jeans, each drop a tiny baptism of release. A woman walking a small white dog paused nearby, watching her with gentle concern. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, her voice soft with the wisdom of years. Alara looked up, and in that moment of raw exposure, something broke open inside her. She could have lied, nodded, offered a weak smile, said just allergies, or, "I'm fine." Instead, she whispered the truth, so quiet she wasn't sure the woman heard it. "I took care of my mother for 17 years. She died 3 months ago. I don't know who I am without her." The woman didn't offer platitudes. She didn't say she's in a better place, or time heals all wounds. She simply sat beside Alara on the bench, her dog curling patiently at their feet, and placed a wrinkled hand over Alara's. They sat like that for 10 minutes, not speaking, the older woman's thumb stroking the back of Alara's hand in a rhythm as old as comfort itself. When she finally rose to leave, she squeezed Alara's shoulder and said only, "The love doesn't disappear with the person. It has to go somewhere. Be gentle with where it lands." Then she walked away, her dog trotting beside her, and Alara understood she had been given a gift far more valuable than advice: witness. For 10 minutes, her grief had been seen. Not fixed, not minimized, not redirected toward positivity, but seen. And in being seen, it became bearable. That afternoon, something shifted in the apartment. It was still sterile, still soulless, but it no longer felt like a sentence. It felt like a space, a neutral ground upon which she might slowly begin to rebuild. She opened the curtains fully, letting the afternoon light flood the room. She took the small wooden bird from her mother, the one carved when she was 6, and placed it on the windowsill where it caught the sun, its painted eyes seeming to watch the world outside with quiet curiosity. She made tea not because she needed to fill time, but because she wanted it. And when she sat at the small table by the window to drink it, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. From this angle, if she craned her neck slightly, she could see a sliver of the park, the very pond where she'd sat that morning. A connection. Not much but enough. Days bled into weeks, then months. Alara established rhythms not of duty but of discovery. She walked every morning, gradually extending her routes until she knew the neighborhood's secret corners. The alley where wildflowers pushed through cracked concrete, the old oak tree with a bench beneath it that faced east for perfect sunrise viewing, the bakery that sold day-old bread at noon for half price. She began buying books again, not with the frantic hunger of someone trying to escape, but with the careful selection of a gardener choosing seeds. She read slowly, savoring sentences, allowing herself to reread paragraphs not from distraction but from delight. The pathways in her mind, paved over by years of medical vigilance, began to reopen, tender shoots of concentration pushing through the hardened soil of hypervigilance. She discovered a free community garden 2 blocks away and tentatively signed up for a small plot. The first time she knelt in the dirt, her hands sinking into cool, dark earth, something primal unclenched in her chest. This was work with a different temporality, not the urgent, crisis-driven labor of caregiving, but patient, cyclical work that honored seasons and decay and rebirth. She planted tomatoes and basil and marigolds not because they were necessary for survival, but because they were beautiful. The distinction felt revolutionary. She also began the difficult work of reconnecting with the world of people. Not through forced socialization, she wasn't ready for dinner parties or group activities, but through small, manageable interactions. She learned the names of the cashiers at the grocery store. She exchanged pleasantries with the elderly man who fed pigeons in the park each morning. She joined a library book club that met once a month, sitting quietly in the back at first, listening more than speaking, but gradually offering a comment here and there until her voice, and used to expressing opinions not related to medical care, grew stronger. No one knew her history. No one looked at her with the mixture of admiration and pity she'd grown accustomed to during her mother's illness. They simply saw a quiet woman in her early 40s who liked historical fiction and had interesting things to say about character motivation. It was, she realized with a start, the first time in decades she was being perceived as a person rather than a role. But the forgetting continued its quiet work elsewhere. Mark called every few weeks, his conversations growing shorter, more perfunctory. He no longer asked how she was adjusting. He simply reported on his life, work projects, the children's achievements, vacation plans, and ended with a cheerful, "Well, take care," that left no room for her reality. Once, during a rare video call, his daughter, now 11, wandered into the frame and asked, "Who's that?" Mark laughed. "That's Aunt Alara. She used to help Grandma when she was sick." The casualness of used to struck her like a physical blow. As if those 17 years were a brief internship rather than the central arc of her adult life. As if her mother's illness had been a minor inconvenience requiring temporary assistance rather than a cataclysm that had reshaped entire lives. She forced a smile for the camera, waved at her niece, and ended the call as soon as politely possible. Afterward, she sat in the gathering dusk, the wooden bird silhouetted against the darkening sky, and allowed herself to feel the anger she'd been suppressing. It was not a hot, explosive anger but a cold, deep one, the kind that forms at the bottom of oceans and shapes continents over millennia. They were forgetting not just her sacrifice, but the very reality of her mother's suffering. By smoothing over the sharp edges of that history, they were erasing the magnitude of what she had endured. And in erasing the magnitude, they were making her endurance seem small, unremarkable, replaceable. This realization coincided with an invitation that arrived unexpectedly in her mailbox, a formal announcement for a community awards ceremony. The local historical society was honoring residents who had made significant contributions to preserving our town's heritage. Alara almost tossed it aside. What did she have to do with town heritage? But something made her read further. And there, in the list of honorees, was the name of Mrs. Gable, the elderly librarian who had once been her mentor. Alara's heart leapt. She hadn't seen Agnes Gable in over 20 years, not since she'd left the library to care for her mother. She remembered Agnes as a formidable woman in her 60s then, with silver hair coiled in a perfect bun and a knowledge of local history so vast it seemed she'd witnessed every event personally. She had been the one to encourage Alara's interest in book restoration, had let her practice on damaged volumes no one else wanted, had spoken of archives and preservation with a reverence usually reserved for sacred texts. On impulse, Alara decided to attend. Not to reconnect, she wasn't ready for that, but simply to witness someone she'd once admired being honored for a life of quiet contribution. The ceremony was held in the town hall, a grand old building with vaulted ceilings and portraits of stern-faced founders lining the walls. Alara arrived early and took a seat in the back, wanting to observe without being observed. The room filled gradually with townspeople, mostly older residents dressed in their Sunday best, their faces etched with the particular dignity that comes from long residence in one place. When Agnes Gable was called to the stage, Alara barely recognized her. Age had softened her sharp edges, bent her spine slightly, clouded the fierce intelligence in her eyes. But when she spoke, her voice still clear, still carrying the weight of conviction, Alara felt a jolt of recognition so powerful it stole her breath. Agnes spoke not of her own achievements but of the stories embedded in objects. The diary of a Civil War soldier found in an attic, the quilt stitched by a formerly enslaved woman, the handwritten ledger of the town's first black-owned business. History isn't just dates and battles, she said, her gaze sweeping the room. It's the accumulation of ordinary lives. The meals cooked, the children raised, the hands held in sickness and in sorrow. Most of these lives leave no monument. Their names are forgotten within a generation. But their love remains in the DNA of this community. We honor them by remembering that preservation isn't about saving grand things. It's about honoring the small, daily acts of devotion that hold civilization together when everything else is falling apart. Alara sat perfectly still, tears streaming silently down her face. No one in that room knew she was speaking directly to her. No one knew that for 17 years she had performed precisely those small, daily acts of devotion. Acts that would leave no monument, whose name would be forgotten within a generation. But in that moment, she felt seen across time and space by a woman who understood the sacred geometry of sacrifice. When the ceremony ended and people milled about with refreshments, Alara found herself standing near the stage as Agnes accepted congratulations. Their eyes met. For a long moment, Agnes simply looked at her, her gaze penetrating in a way that suggested she saw not just the woman before her but all the years that had passed between them. Then she excused herself from the crowd and walked slowly toward Alara. "You're Eleanor's girl," she said, using Alara's mother's maiden name. "I wondered if you'd come." Her voice was softer now, stripped of its ceremonial resonance. Alara could only nod, her throat tight. Agnes studied her face, her eyes lingering on the lines of exhaustion that still lingered around Alara's eyes despite months of rest. "I heard about your mother. And your father before her." She paused, choosing her words with care. "I also heard you were the one who stayed." The simplicity of the statement, the acknowledgement of the choice, the recognition of its weight, undid Alara completely. She felt the carefully constructed dam within her crack. "I didn't know how not to," she whispered. Agnes reached out and took her hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "There are two kinds of forgetting in this world," she said quietly, so only Alara could hear. "The first is the natural erosion of memory, the way details fade, names slip away, photographs yellow at the edges. This kind of forgetting is neutral. It simply is. But the second kind, the deliberate forgetting, is a violence. It's what happens when people refuse to acknowledge the cost of their own comfort, the labor that made their survival possible. Don't confuse the two. And don't let their forgetting convince you that what you did didn't matter." They stood like that for a long moment, hands clasped in the crowded room, two women connected by decades and by an understanding of what it means to give everything in a world that rewards taking. When they parted, Agnes pressed a small card into Alara's palm. "I still volunteer at the Historical Society twice a week," she said. "We're digitizing old photographs. Could use someone with gentle hands." She didn't wait for an answer. She simply turned and rejoined the crowd, leaving Alara standing alone with the card in her hand and a single fragile seed of possibility taking root in her chest. That night, lying in bed with the curtains open to the moonlit sky, Alara thought about Agnes's words. She thought about the difference between natural forgetting and deliberate forgetting. And she realized with a clarity that felt like sunrise that her brother Mark wasn't deliberately erasing her sacrifice. He simply lacked the capacity to hold its weight. To acknowledge the full magnitude of what she had given would be to acknowledge his own absence, his own failure to share the burden, his own comfortable life built in part on her suffering. It was easier, kinder even, to smooth the narrative into something manageable. Alara helped Mom through a difficult time. Not, Ilara gave up her entire adulthood so I could build a career and raise a family without the inconvenience of a dying parent. The truth was too heavy for him to carry. So he carried a lighter version, and in doing so, he left her holding the full, crushing weight alone. This understanding did not bring forgiveness, not yet. But it brought something almost as valuable: clarity. She saw now that the forgetting was not a reflection of her worth, but a reflection of others' limitations. The world is not designed to honor invisible labor, especially when that labor is performed by women. It is designed to consume that labor and then act as if it never happened, as if children raise themselves, as if the elderly die peacefully without the midnight vigils of exhausted daughters, as if families hold together through some inherent magic rather than the daily, grinding work of people who choose love over freedom again and again and again. She rose from bed and walked to the windowsill, picking up the wooden bird. In the moonlight, its carved feathers seemed to shimmer. She thought of her mother carving it all those years ago, her hands steady, her focus absolute, creating beauty for no reason other than love. That act of creation had outlasted the hands that made it. Perhaps her own acts of devotion would do the same, not in memory, not in gratitude, but in the simple, unquantifiable fact that her mother had been loved well at the end of her life. That her father had not drowned completely in his grief because she had been the buoy. That the world, in some small way, had been made more humane because one woman had chosen to stay when she could have left. It was not the reward she might have imagined in her youth, the career, the family, the life of visible achievement. But it was real. And reality, however painful, is always more substantial than fantasy. The next morning she did not just open the curtains. She opened the window, letting the cool air flood the room. She walked to the Historical Society and asked for Agnes Gable. When the volunteer at the desk pointed her toward the archives room in the back, Ilara's heart beat with a rhythm she hadn't felt in decades, not the frantic pulse of emergency, but the steady thrum of purpose. She found Agnes bent over a light table, a magnifying glass in her hand, carefully examining a faded photograph of Main Street from 1923. Without looking up, Agnes said, "I was wondering when you'd come." Ilara stood in the doorway, the scent of old paper and lemon-scented cleaner filling her lungs. "I don't know anything about digitizing photographs," she admitted. Agnes finally looked up, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "You know how to handle fragile things," she said. "That's the only skill that matters here." And in that moment, Ilara understood something fundamental. The work of preservation, whether of photographs or memories or human dignity, is never finished. It is passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, by those willing to bear witness to what others have forgotten. She had spent 17 years preserving one fragile life. Perhaps now she could learn to preserve other fragile things. The stories etched in fading ink, the faces captured in silver gelatin, the ordinary lives that built this town brick by brick and were now vanishing from collective memory. It would not erase the pain of being forgotten. Nothing could. But it might transform that pain into something generative, a commitment to ensuring that others' sacrifices would not suffer the same fate. She stepped into the room, the door closing softly behind her. The forgetting would continue its work in the world outside, in her brother's conversations, in her niece's vague recollections, in the new family living in her childhood home who would never know the history embedded in its floorboards. But here, in this quiet room filled with the ghosts of ordinary lives, she could begin the slow, sacred work of remembrance. Not for herself, she had made her peace with her own erasure, but for all the others like her. The women who gave everything and were forgotten, whose names would never appear on plaques or in ceremonies, whose love would outlive their memory but not their impact. She would be their witness. She would hold their stories when no one else would. And in doing so, she would finally understand the paradox at the heart of her sacrifice. That to give everything is not to lose yourself, but to discover what remains when everything else has been stripped away. Not gratitude. Not recognition. Not even memory. But love itself, pure, unadorned, unrequited love that continues to exist simply because it was real. And what is more real than that can never truly be forgotten. It can only wait, patiently, for someone to remember how to see it again. The archives room was a sanctuary of silence, broken only by the soft whisper of pages turning and the occasional creak of the old building settling into its bones. Dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light that cut through high windows, each particle a tiny universe suspended in time. Ilara stood just inside the doorway, breathing in the scent of aging paper, leather bindings, and the faint, sweet decay of cellulose. A perfume that awakened something deep within her, a memory of who she had been before the long years of caregiving had sanded her down to utility. Agnes did not look up immediately. She finished her examination of the photograph, made a careful notation in a leather-bound ledger, then set down her magnifying glass with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that haste was the enemy of preservation. "Come here," she said, her voice softer now that they were alone. "Look at this." Ilara approached the light table, her footsteps silent on the worn oak floor. The photograph showed a woman standing on the steps of what appeared to be the town hall, circa 1910. She wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back severely, but her posture held a quiet dignity. In her arms she cradled an infant, while two small children clung to her skirts. Behind her, slightly out of focus, stood a man in a suit, presumably her husband, his hand resting casually on the railing as if the scene existed primarily for his benefit. "Her name was Eleanor Vance," Agnes said, tracing the woman's face with a gloved finger. "Widowed at 32 with 4 children when her husband fell from a scaffold at the mill. The official history books mention him, Thomas Vance, one of the town's early industrialists. They don't mention that his fortune was built on 12-hour days while his wife managed everything else. The household, the children's education, the social obligations that kept his reputation polished. When he died, the business collapsed within a year. But Eleanor? She took in sewing, ran a boarding house, put all 4 children through school. 2 became teachers, 1 a doctor, the youngest a lawyer who later helped draft labor protections for mill workers." Agnes looked up, her eyes meeting Ilara's. None of the history books mention Eleanor. But every child who attended the Vance Elementary School, which she secretly funded through decades of scrimping, walked across a stage bearing her husband's name. She gave everything. They forgot her. Sound familiar? The words landed not as an accusation but as an offering. A key slipped into a lock Ilara hadn't known existed. She stared at the photograph, at the woman's tired but resolute eyes, and felt a connection across a century that was more real than any she'd felt in years. This was not just history. It was lineage. A silent sisterhood of women who had poured themselves out like water until nothing remained but the vessels they had filled. "I've been looking through our collection," Agnes continued, her voice dropping even lower as if sharing a secret the walls themselves might overhear. "I find them everywhere once you know how to look. The women who held families together while men made names for themselves. The daughters who sacrificed education to care for aging parents. The wives who managed households through depressions and wars while their contributions were recorded as footnotes to their husbands' achievements." She gestured to shelves lining the walls, each filled with boxes labeled with names and dates. "We have thousands of photographs here. Maybe 10% show women alone, without children to define them, without husbands beside them. The rest? They're accessories in someone else's story. And the stories we do have about them are almost always filtered through male perspectives. Mrs. John Smith, devoted wife and mother, as if those roles consumed their entire identities." Ilara reached out tentatively and touched the edge of the photograph. "How do we recover them?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The real women beneath the footnotes?" Agnes smiled, a slow unfolding of lines around her eyes that spoke of decades spent finding beauty in fragments. "We listen to what the objects tell us. This photograph? Look at her hands." She adjusted the magnifying glass. "See the calluses on her right index finger and thumb? Not from sewing, that would be on the left hand for a right-handed person. These are from writing. Hours of it. And look at the children's shoes, perfectly mended, but with a distinctive stitch pattern used by the local shoemaker who also happened to be the town's only educated black man in 1912. She was paying him directly, bypassing her husband's known prejudices. Small details. But they tell a story the official record erased." She turned to a nearby cart holding several acid-free boxes. "I've been saving something for you," she said, lifting the lid of one to reveal a collection of letters tied with faded ribbon. "These belong to Clara Mitchell. She ran the town's first library, this very building, from 1935 to 1968. Never married. Devoted her life to making books accessible to mill workers' children who couldn't afford school supplies. She died alone in a small apartment above what's now the pharmacy on Main Street. The town council named the new library branch after the mayor who approved its funding in 1972. They never mentioned Clara." Ilara carefully lifted the top letter from the bundle. The paper was brittle, the ink faded to a soft brown, but the handwriting remained elegant and precise. She read aloud, her voice gaining strength as she went, "October 12, 1943. Another boy came today, Tommy Reeves, no older than 10, his hands still raw from the mill. He asked for books about stars. I gave him a volume on astronomy I'd been saving, though I know his father will likely sell it for cigarettes. But for one afternoon, Tommy sat by the window and traced constellations with his finger, and in his eyes I saw a universe expanding beyond the smokestacks. This is why I stay. Not for recognition, God knows I'll receive none, but because someone must hold the door open for those who would otherwise never glimpse what lies beyond their circumstances. Ilara's voice broke on the last word. She set the letter down gently as if it might crumble to dust in her hands. The parallel was too precise to be coincidence. Clara Mitchell holding open a door for mill workers' children. Ilara holding up a collapsing world for her mother. Both acts of devotion performed without expectation of reward, both destined for erasure. Yet here was Clara's voice, speaking across 80 years, finding its way to Ilara in this quiet room when she needed it most. She knew, Ilara whispered. She knew no one would remember her. Agnes nodded slowly. And she did it anyway. That's the heart of it, isn't it? The moral calculus of sacrifice isn't about the return. It's about the necessity of the act itself. When you see a need that no one else will meet, you meet it, not because you'll be thanked, but because the alternative is to watch someone drown while you stand safely on shore. The words settled in Ilara's chest like stones finding their place in a riverbed, finally coming to rest after years of being tossed by currents of resentment and grief. She had spent months wrestling with the injustice of being forgotten, measuring her sacrifice against the gratitude she'd received and finding the scales catastrophically unbalanced. But Agnes was offering a different framework altogether, that the value of giving everything lies not in the memory it creates in others, but in the integrity it forges in the giver. To give when no one is watching, when no reward awaits, when even memory will fail, that is the purest form of love. Not transactional. Not performative. Simply necessary like breathing. She began volunteering at the archives 3 days a week, her hands gradually regaining the delicate strength required for handling fragile documents. She learned to wear cotton gloves, to support photographs at their edges, to adjust humidity levels in storage cases. Under Agnes's guidance, she discovered a talent for reading between the lines of historical records, not just what was written but what was omitted. She found tax records showing women listed as dependents, while managing households that employed servants. She uncovered diary entries where women wrote of indisposition, on days when census records showed infant deaths. She pieced together lives from fragments: a receipt for spectacles purchased for an aging mother-in-law, a letter refusing a suitor because "my sister requires my care," a will leaving a small inheritance to a faithful companion, who was almost certainly a lover in an era that could not name such relationships. Each discovery felt like an act of resurrection. With every woman she pulled from the shadows of official history, she felt a corresponding lightness in her own spirit, as if by honoring their forgotten sacrifices, she was slowly releasing herself from the prison of her own erasure. She wasn't seeking recognition for herself anymore. She was building a memorial, not of marble and bronze but of recovered stories, of names restored to their proper places in the narrative. And in doing so, she was learning to hold her own story with gentleness rather than bitterness. One rainy afternoon in late autumn, as they worked side by side transcribing a collection of Civil War letters written by soldiers' wives, Agnes spoke without looking up from her work. "My mother had polio when I was 16. Left her paralyzed from the waist down. My father left 6 months later, said he couldn't watch the woman he loved become a burden. So I became the adult. Dropped out of high school. Took in laundry. Bathed her, fed her, carried her to the outhouse in the winter cold because we couldn't afford an indoor toilet." She paused, her pen hovering over the page. "I resented her for years. Not for being sick, that wasn't her fault. But for needing me so completely that I had to disappear. I used to stare at my reflection in the wash basin and not recognize the girl looking back. She was all duty and no desire." Ilara stopped her own work, her breath catching. She had never imagined Agnes, so composed, so accomplished, carrying such a history. "I got her into a home when I was 24, Agnes continued, her voice even but her knuckles white around the pen. "It was the right decision. She needed professional care I couldn't provide. But the guilt? God, the guilt was a physical thing. A stone in my stomach I carried for 20 years. When she died, my brother, who'd visited exactly twice in 8 years, gave a eulogy about how brave she'd been. Never mentioned who changed her sheets when she soiled them. Never mentioned who sold her own textbooks to buy medicine. At the reception afterward, he clapped me on the shoulder and said, 'You were a good daughter. She never would have made it without you.' And I wanted to scream. I didn't just help her make it. I gave her my youth, my education, my first love, who left because he said I was married to my mother. I gave everything. And now you stand here eating potato salad as if none of it happened." She finally looked at Alara, her eyes glistening but dry. I carried that anger for decades. It poisoned my first marriage. Made me keep people at arm's length. I thought if I never needed anyone again, no one could make me disappear like that. She set down her pen and folded her hands on the table. The forgetting didn't hurt as much as the casualness of it. The way my sacrifice became a footnote in my brother's narrative of our family's resilience. As if her survival was inevitable rather than purchased daily with pieces of my soul. Alara reached across the table and covered Agnes's hands with her own. No words were necessary. In that touch passed an understanding deeper than language, the recognition of shared territory, of wounds that look different on the surface but bleed the same color underneath. What changed? Alara finally asked. How did you stop carrying the stone? Agnes smiled, a genuine softening this time. I started doing this work. Not just preserving objects, but listening to the silences between the words in these documents. I realized I wasn't alone in my erasure. That for centuries women have been giving everything and being forgotten, not as punishment but as policy. A system designed to consume female labor without compensation, without recognition, without even memory. Once I understood it wasn't personal, that my brother wasn't uniquely cruel, just uniquely unexamined, I could stop waiting for him to see me. I could start seeing myself. The rain intensified against the windows, a steady rhythm that seemed to underscore the truth in Agnes's words. Alara thought of Mark, his cheerful obliviousness, his genuine belief that he was being supportive by urging her to start over. He wasn't malicious. He was simply incapable of holding the complexity of her experience. To acknowledge her sacrifice in its full magnitude would require him to sit with his own guilt, his own absence during their mother's decline. And most people, she was learning, would rather forget than feel that kind of discomfort. She began spending her afternoons not just preserving history, but interrogating it. She started a small project Agnes encouraged but didn't officially sanction. A hidden ledger where she recorded the stories of women the official archives overlooked. She called it, the Book of Unseen Women. In its pages, she wrote of seamstresses who organized the town's first labor strike but were written out of history books when male leaders took credit. Of midwives who delivered generations of children but were prosecuted when male doctors sought to professionalize childbirth. Of daughters like herself who vanished into the care of aging parents, their names surviving only as caretaker in obituaries while brothers inherited family businesses and legacies. One entry particularly haunted her. She'd found it in a box of donated papers from the old county poorhouse, a single page torn from a diary, dated 1897. The handwriting was elegant but faded, the paper water-stained as if by tears. They took my baby this morning. Said I was unfit, a widow with no means. I begged them to let me keep her just one more night, to memorize the curve of her cheek, the weight of her in my arms. They said sentimentality was a luxury women like me couldn't afford. I scrubbed floors for 3 years to save enough for a room of my own. I thought if I worked hard enough, loved fiercely enough, the world would make space for us. But the world does not make space for women who have nothing but love to offer. It takes the love and discards the vessel. I will work until my hands bleed. I will find her. And when I do, I will not tell her how I suffered to get her back. I will only hold her. Because she must never know the price of a mother's love. That is the final sacrifice, to ensure the beloved never comprehends the cost. Alara copied the passage into her ledger with trembling hands. She thought of all the mothers throughout history who had given children up, not through lack of love, but through an excess of it, choosing their child's survival over their own desire to keep them close. She thought of her own mother, in the early stages of dementia, pressing a worn photograph of Alara as a child into her hands and whispering, "Don't ever stop living for yourself, my love. Promise me." Even in decline, her mother had been trying to protect her from the very fate she herself had imposed, the slow erasure of self in service to another. That evening, walking home through streets slick with rain, Alara felt a shift not in her circumstances but in her understanding of them. The forgetting hadn't stopped. Mark had texted that morning about his son's soccer tournament without once asking how she was, but its power over her had diminished. She was no longer waiting for recognition that would never come. She was building something else entirely, a testament. Not for herself, but for all the women who had given everything and been forgotten. Her sacrifice would not be memorialized in speeches or etched on plaques. But it would live in the careful way she handled Clara Mitchell's letters, in the tenderness with which she restored Eleanor Vance's photograph, in the meticulous care she took to ensure these women's stories would not vanish a second time. Her love for her mother, though unacknowledged by the world, had become the foundation for a different kind of love. The love of truth, of memory, of justice for those history had overlooked. She reached her apartment building and paused before going inside, tilting her face up to the rain. The drops were cold against her skin, each one a tiny baptism. She thought of the woman in the poorhouse diary, scrubbing floors until her hands bled for a child she might never see again. She thought of Clara Mitchell, alone in her apartment above the pharmacy, surrounded by books no one knew she'd saved for mill workers' children. She thought of her mother, in the final years when recognition had faded but some deeper knowing remained, a hand reaching for hers in the dark not because she remembered who Alara was, but because she remembered that this hand meant safety. And she understood at last the terrible, beautiful truth. Love does not require witness to be real. A star burns in a distant galaxy unseen by any eye, yet its light is no less real for its solitude. A flower blooms in a remote valley never visited by humans, yet its beauty exists independent of observation. Her 17 years of devotion had been real not because they were remembered, but because they were given. The love itself was the monument. The giving itself was the reward. Not in any sentimental Hallmark card sense, but in the profound existential truth that to love fully, even when that love consumes you entirely, is to participate in the fundamental creative force of the universe. It is to say yes to connection when isolation would be easier. It is to choose another's survival over your own comfort. It is, in the end, the only thing that matters. She entered her apartment, dripping rainwater on the beige carpet she'd once hated for its sterility. Now she saw it differently, not as a blank slate awaiting decoration, but as neutral ground upon which she was slowly, carefully, rebuilding a self that could hold both the sacrifice and the joy, both the erasure and the remembrance. She hung her damp coat by the door, ran a bath with lavender oil Agnes had given her, and as she sank into the warm water, she allowed herself to feel, not just the grief of being forgotten, but the pride of having given everything anyway. Not as a victim but as a witness. Not as a martyr, but as a keeper of flames that others had tried to extinguish. Later, wrapped in a towel, she stood at her windowsill and picked up the wooden bird. In the dim light of her apartment, its carved eyes seemed to hold a secret. She thought of her mother's hands shaping this small beauty during a time of peace, before illness and decline, before the long surrender of self. And she realized her mother had left her more than this bird. She had left her the capacity for devotion itself, the understanding that to give everything is not to lose yourself, but to discover what remains when all the superficial layers have been stripped away. Not ambition. Not recognition. Not even memory. But love itself, pure, unadorned, unbreakable love that continues to exist simply because it was real. The forgetting would continue. Mark would tell his children simplified stories about their grandmother's illness. Her niece would grow up with only vague impressions of the aunt who had once been central to the family's survival. The new owners of her childhood home would paint over the pencil marks on the door frame, sand the floors until no trace of history remained. This was the natural order of things. Memory fades, narratives simplify, the world moves forward without looking back. But Alara would remember. And in remembering, she would preserve not just her own story, but the stories of all the unseen women who had come before her. She would become a living archive of devotion. And that, she understood as she placed the wooden bird back on the sill, its beak turned toward the coming dawn, was a form of immortality no forgetting could touch. For as long as one person remembered the truth of a sacrifice, that sacrifice retained its power. And she would remember. She would remember for all of them. She would remember until her own hands grew too frail to hold the photographs, until her own voice grew too weak to speak the names. And before she left this world, she would pass the remembering to someone else. A young woman perhaps, standing uncertain in a doorway, needing to know that her sacrifice mattered even when no one else would acknowledge it. This was the covenant of the unseen women, to hold each other across time, to witness each other's disappearances, to ensure that no act of love, however invisible, however unacknowledged, would vanish completely from the earth. It was not a grand legacy. It would not be written in history books. But it was real. And reality, however quiet, is always more enduring than recognition. She turned from the window, the first stars appearing in the violet sky, and knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones. She had given everything. They had forgotten her. But the love remained. And love, once given, can never truly be taken back. It simply changes form, becoming memory, becoming witness, becoming the quiet force that holds up the world when no one is watching. And that was enough. It had always been enough. Winter arrived not with a storm but with a slow seep of cold that settled into the bones of the town and into Alara's apartment. The world outside her window turned monochrome, gray skies, skeletal trees, sidewalks dusted with a fine powder of snow that never quite accumulated enough to transform the landscape. Inside the archives, the cold was kept at bay by ancient radiators that hissed and clanked like living creatures, their heat creating pockets of warmth where Alara and Agnes worked side by side, their breath sometimes visible in the air between them as they handled fragile documents too delicate for the modern heating system. It was during these quiet winter months that Alara began to notice the subtle ways the past whispered to her, not through grand revelations, but through small, almost imperceptible details that accumulated like snowfall until the landscape of understanding had been completely transformed. She was cataloging a collection of household account books from the 1920s when she found it. A single-line item in the meticulous script of a woman named Margaret Lowell, dated March 14, 1927. Payment to H. Jenkins, $3.50 for medicine and care of mother-in-law, week of March 7 to 13. Nothing remarkable on its surface, just one of thousands of such entries she'd processed. But something made her pause. She flipped back through the previous month's entries. Week after week, the same payment. Sometimes $2.75, sometimes $4, but always to H. Jenkins for the care of a mother-in-law who, according to census records, lived in the Lowell household. Alara cross-referenced the address with property records. The Lowells owned a modest but respectable home, certainly large enough to accommodate an elderly relative. Why pay an outsider to care for a family member living under the same roof? She brought the account book to Agnes, who adjusted her glasses and studied the entry for a long moment before speaking. "Look at the other expenses that week," she said softly. "See the entry for new shoes for Robert? And payment to piano teacher for Elizabeth?" She turned to Alara, her eyes sharp with understanding. Margaret Lowell wasn't paying H. Jenkins to care for her mother-in-law instead of doing it herself. She was paying H. Jenkins to care for her mother-in-law so she could continue caring for her children, managing the household, and maintaining the social appearances expected of a woman of her class. She was outsourcing one form of invisible labor to preserve her capacity for another. The realization settled over Alara like a weight. For 17 years, she had believed her sacrifice was unique in its totality, that she alone had shouldered the entire burden of her mother's care without relief, without respite, without recognition. But Margaret Lowell had done the same, and hundreds of thousands of women before and after her. They hadn't been celebrated for their devotion. They hadn't been memorialized for their endurance. They had simply done what needed to be done, their labor absorbed into the smooth functioning of families and communities as if it had cost them nothing at all. The difference was that Margaret Lowell had at least possessed the financial means to purchase fragments of her own freedom, a luxury Alara had never known. Yet both women had participated in the same silent economy of sacrifice, trading pieces of themselves for the survival of others. One afternoon, as a late January snow fell softly beyond the high windows, Agnes brought out a small wooden box she kept locked in her desk drawer. "I've been waiting for the right moment to show you this," she said, setting the box on the table between them. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a collection of small objects: a tarnished silver thimble, a lock of hair tied with ribbon, a child's milk tooth, a dried flower pressed between sheets of tissue paper. Each item was labeled with a name and date in Agnes's precise hand. "These belong to women whose stories exist nowhere else," Agnes explained, lifting the thimble gently. Sarah Wilkins, 1842 to 1918. Seamstress. Supported her blind sister and 3 orphan nieces after the influenza epidemic of 1890 took their parents. Never married. Died in the county home at 76. This thimble wore a permanent groove into her finger over 60 years of stitching other people's clothes so her family could eat. She set it down and picked up the lock of hair. Clara Finch, 1875 to 1953. Gave up a teaching position to care for her father after he lost his leg in a railroad accident. Kept this lock of his hair after he died. She never spoke of him again. Her brother inherited the family farm. Clara lived in a single room above a bakery for the rest of her life. Alara reached out and touched the dried flower, a violet, its purple faded to a ghost of color. "Eleanor Hayes," Agnes said without prompting. 1899 to 1972. Cared for her mother with advanced Parkinson's for 23 years. Gave up an engagement to a man who promised to wait but didn't. This flower was pressed in her Bible on the day her mother died. The only record of her grief. Alara's breath caught. Eleanor Hayes. Her mother's name had been Eleanor. A coincidence, surely, but the synchronicity felt like a message from the universe itself. She looked more closely at the flower, at the careful way it had been preserved between tissue paper, at the faint pencil notation on the edge, April 3, 1972. Finally at peace. Not her mother's death date, her mother had died just months ago, but another Eleanor, another daughter, another 23 years of devotion ending in the same ambiguous relief that Ilara herself had experienced. Not joy at the ending, not sorrow at the loss, but the simple, staggering fact of survival. She kept it in her Bible, Ilara whispered. Agnes nodded. Between Psalms 23 and 24. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And the next chapter, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. She was marking the transition, from being a shepherd to someone else's needs, to finally reclaiming a piece of the earth for herself. She looked at Ilara, her gaze penetrating. You're not the first woman to walk this path, my dear. And you won't be the last. But you might be among the first to document it, not as tragedy but as testament. That evening, walking home through streets glazed with ice, Ilara felt the weight of the day settle into her bones, not as burden but as substance. For the first time since her mother's death, she did not feel alone in her erasure. She was part of a lineage, a silent sisterhood stretching back centuries, each woman passing the torch of invisible labor to the next without fanfare, without recognition, but with a fidelity that transcended memory itself. They had been forgotten by history, yes. But they had not been forgotten by each other. Their stories lived in objects like these: a thimble worn smooth by devotion, a lock of hair preserved as relic, a flower pressed between psalms marking the end of one life and the uncertain beginning of another. She began keeping her own ledger, not just of historical women she discovered in the archives, but of the women she encountered in her daily life. The cashier at the grocery store who worked double shifts to support her grandson after her daughter's overdose. The elderly woman in the park who fed pigeons each morning while speaking softly to the empty space beside her. Her husband of 60 years, gone now, but still her companion in ritual. The young mother at the library who fell asleep in a chair while her toddler played quietly nearby, dark circles under her eyes speaking of nights spent soothing fevers and fears. These women were living the same story, giving everything, receiving little, continuing anyway. And no one was documenting their sacrifices. No one was preserving their names. They would vanish from memory within a generation, their labor absorbed into the seamless narrative of families that got through difficult times. Ilara started small. She bought a simple notebook with a cloth cover and began writing. Not with the clinical detachment of an archivist, but with the tenderness of a witness. She recorded the cashier's name, Martha, and the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking. She noted the elderly woman's ritual, always arriving at 10:15 a.m., always scattering seeds in a perfect circle, always whispering something to the empty space before walking slowly away. She observed the young mother's exhaustion not as failure but as evidence of devotion so total it had consumed her very capacity for self-preservation. These were not tragedies to be fixed. They were testaments to be honored. One Saturday morning in early February, she arrived at the archives to find Agnes waiting for her with an unusual expression, part excitement, part trepidation. I received a call yesterday from the county clerk's office, she said, leading Ilara to a newly delivered box in the corner of the room. They're clearing out storage space and offered me first pick of anything historical before the rest goes to the landfill. She lifted the flaps of the cardboard box to reveal a jumble of papers, photographs, and small objects. Most of it is mundane, property records, tax assessments. But look at this. She pulled out a bundle of letters tied with a fraying blue ribbon. The handwriting on the envelope was elegant but faded. To my daughter, should I not survive this confinement. Ilara's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the bundle. It's from 1883, Agnes said softly. The writer was a woman named Abigail Poole. She died in childbirth at 28. These letters were never delivered. They sat in a desk drawer for 40 years until her husband remarried and his new wife discovered them while cleaning. She apparently hid them away rather than give them to the daughter, who was raised believing her mother had died suddenly of fever. Ilara carefully untied the ribbon and lifted the first letter. The paper crackled with age, but the ink remained legible. My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, then I have failed in my most sacred duty, to raise you myself. Forgive a mother's selfishness, but know this, I did not die of fever. I died of exhaustion. Not the dramatic exhaustion of illness, but the slow erosion of self that comes from giving everything to everyone else until nothing remains for the giver. Your father's business failing, his mother moving in with us after her stroke, your brother's persistent fevers, the constant need for mending and cooking and soothing and managing. I poured myself out like water until the vessel was empty. And when the physician said I was with child again, I felt not joy but terror. How could I possibly stretch myself thinner? But I said nothing. A good wife does not speak of such things. A good mother welcomes each child as blessing. So I smiled and accepted congratulations and began preparing another nursery while my body whispered its warnings. I ignored them. I had always ignored them. And now, on the eve of this child's birth, I know with certainty that I will not survive it. Not because of any medical complication but because I have nothing left to give. My body has simply decided it can give no more. Ilara had to stop reading, her vision blurred by tears. She looked up at Agnes, who nodded gravely. Keep going, she urged. The rest is important. Ilara wiped her eyes and continued. Do not blame your father. He did not see my depletion because I hid it well, as all women learn to do. He saw a capable wife, a devoted mother, a woman who managed everything with grace. He did not see the nights I wept silently into my pillow so as not to disturb him. He did not see the meals I skipped so the children could have seconds. He did not see the dreams I folded away like outgrown dresses, promising myself I would return to them someday. Someday never came. And I do not regret my choices. I loved you fiercely. I would make them again. But I need you to know the truth. Love is not infinite. It requires fuel. And when a woman gives everything without ever receiving replenishment, she eventually has nothing left, not even for herself. This is not a failure of character. It is a failure of systems that demand endless giving from women while offering nothing in return but the hollow currency of being needed. If you have daughters someday, teach them to receive as freely as they give. Teach them that self-preservation is not selfishness but necessity. Teach them to say no without guilt, to rest without shame, to want things for themselves without apology. And if you find yourself in my position, loving so deeply that you forget yourself, remember this letter. Remember that your mother loved you enough to warn you away from her fate. My greatest gift to you is not my sacrifice but this truth: you must keep a piece of yourself for yourself. Always. No matter how much you love. No matter how great the need. Guard your soul as fiercely as you guard those you love. For without it you cannot truly love anyone, not even yourself. Ilara set the letter down gently, her hands shaking. The words resonated with a truth so profound it felt like a physical blow. For 17 years she had believed her depletion was a personal failing, that if she had been stronger, more resilient, more capable, she could have given everything without losing herself completely. But Abigail Poole had articulated what Ilara had only felt in her bones, that her exhaustion was not weakness. It was the inevitable result of a system designed to consume women's labor without replenishment. She had not failed. The world had failed her, by expecting infinite giving without acknowledging the cost, by celebrating sacrifice while providing no infrastructure for sustainability, by forgetting the giver while remembering only the gift. I've been thinking about your brother, Agnes said quietly as if reading her thoughts. About the casual way he erases your 17 years of devotion. I don't believe he does it out of malice. I believe he does it because acknowledging your sacrifice in its full magnitude would require him to confront his own complicity in a system that allowed you to disappear. It's easier to forget than to feel that discomfort. And most people, especially men raised to believe the world revolves around their comfort, will always choose ease over truth. Ilara nodded slowly, the pieces clicking into place. Mark wasn't uniquely cruel. He was typically human, choosing the narrative that allowed him to sleep at night over the truth that would haunt him. His forgetting was not an act of violence but an act of self-preservation. And in understanding that, she found herself able to release the expectation that he would ever truly see her. The burden of witness would have to be hers alone, and perhaps that was as it should be. Some truths are too heavy for those who did not live them. They can only be carried by those who bore the weight firsthand. The snow continued falling outside, blanketing the town in silence. Inside the archives, surrounded by the ghosts of women who had given everything and been forgotten, Ilara felt a shift not in her circumstances but in her relationship to them. She was no longer waiting for recognition that would never come. She was building something more enduring, a testament. Not for herself, she had made her peace with her own erasure, but for all the women who would come after her. Her ledger of unseen women was growing, page by page, story by story. She was creating what had never existed for her, a record, a witness, a proof that these sacrifices had happened, that these women had existed, that their love had mattered even when it had been forgotten. One evening, as she walked home through streets glittering with ice under streetlights, she passed a young woman sitting on a bus bench, her face illuminated by the blue glow of a smartphone. Even from a distance, Ilara recognized the particular exhaustion in her posture, the slump of shoulders carrying invisible weight, the way she rubbed her temples between scrolling through messages. A caregiver, Ilara knew instinctively. Perhaps for an aging parent, perhaps for a child with special needs, perhaps for a partner struggling with illness. Another woman giving everything in a world that would eventually forget her. On impulse, Ilara approached the bench. "Long day?" she asked gently. The young woman looked up, startled, then offered a tired smile. "You could say that. My mom's been having a rough week. Dementia's getting worse." Ilara sat beside her, not too close, giving space while offering presence. "I know that road," she said simply. 17 years with my mother." The young woman's eyes widened slightly, then filled with a recognition so profound it needed no words. In that moment, two strangers connected across a chasm of experience, not with advice or platitudes but with the simple acknowledgement, "I see you. I know this weight. You are not alone." They sat together for 10 minutes while snow fell softly around them, two women holding space for each other's invisible labor. When the bus arrived, the young woman stood and hesitated before speaking. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't think anyone's ever just seen it before. Everyone says you're so strong, or she's lucky to have you, but no one ever says, this is hard, or you're allowed to be tired." Ilara nodded. "Remember to keep a piece of yourself for yourself," she said, echoing Abigail Poole's words across a century. "However small, however hidden, guard it fiercely." The young woman stepped onto the bus and found a seat by the window. As the bus pulled away, she pressed her palm against the glass in a silent gesture of gratitude. Ilara stood watching until the taillights disappeared into the snowy dusk, feeling something shift inside her. Not healing, not yet, but the beginning of integration. Her pain was becoming purpose. Her erasure was becoming witness. Her forgetting was becoming remembrance, for others, if not for herself. Back in her apartment, she opened her ledger to a fresh page and began to write. February 12, 2026. Met a young woman on a bus bench. Early 30s. Caring for mother with dementia. Eyes holding 17 years of future exhaustion. Told her to guard a piece of herself. She understood. Some truths need no translation. They live in the bones. She closed the ledger and placed it on her nightstand beside the wooden bird. Outside, the snow continued falling, covering the town in a blanket of white that erased distinctions between sidewalk and street, between yard and road. But beneath the snow, the landscape remained. The roots held fast. The seeds waited. And when spring came, new growth would emerge, not because the winter had been easy, but because life persists even in forgetting, even in erasure, even in silence. Ilara turned off the lamp and lay in the darkness, listening to the soft hush of snow against her window. For the first time in years, she did not feel the crushing weight of being forgotten. She felt instead the quiet power of remembering, of holding space for stories the world had discarded, of honoring sacrifices that would never be memorialized, of ensuring that no woman's devotion would vanish completely from the earth. She had given everything. They had forgotten her. But she would remember them. And in that act of remembrance she had found something the world could not take from her. Purpose. Not the purpose of being needed, but the purpose of bearing witness. Not the purpose of sacrifice, but the purpose of preservation. Not the purpose of being remembered, but the purpose of remembering. The snow fell through the night, silent and steady. And Ilara slept, not the exhausted, dreamless sleep of her early months in the apartment, but a restorative sleep filled with images of women across time reaching for each other across chasms of erasure, their hands almost touching, their stories almost merging, their love almost forming a bridge strong enough to carry them all home. Spring arrived not with a single dramatic thaw but with a gradual softening, the slow retreat of ice from sidewalks, the hesitant green of shoots pushing through soil that had seemed permanently frozen, the lengthening of afternoons until Ilara found herself still working at the archives when golden light flooded the high windows. The world outside her window transformed daily. Bare branches became traceries of delicate green, snowdrops appeared like punctuation marks in the earth's narrative, and the park pond lost its skin of ice to reveal water dark and alive with the promise of renewal. Inside the archives, the radiators fell silent one by one, and the air grew lighter, carrying the scent of old paper warmed by sun rather than artificial heat. It was during this season of emergence that Alara received an email from a university professor in a neighboring state, a Dr. Rebecca Chin who specialized in women's labor history. She had been referred to Alara by Agnes, who had quietly shared excerpts from Alara's ledger of unseen women with a trusted colleague. Dr. Chen's message was brief but compelling. She was writing a book on invisible domestic labor in 20th century America and wondered if Alara might be willing to share her research. Not as an academic, Alara had no credentials, but as a witness. Sometimes the most valuable historians, Dr. Chen wrote, are those who have lived the history they document. Alara read the email 3 times before responding. The offer felt like a door opening in a wall she had long accepted as permanent. 4 months she had been gathering these stories not for publication or recognition, but as an act of private devotion, a way of honoring women the world had discarded. The idea of sharing them felt almost sacrilegious, as if making their sacrifices public would somehow diminish their purity. Yet Agnes, when Alara showed her the email, had placed a hand on her shoulder and said simply, "They deserve witnesses beyond us, my dear. Memory confined to 2 people is fragile. Memory shared becomes legacy." So Alara began the slow work of translating her private ledger into something that could be shared, not as dry academic analysis but as narrative. She wrote of Margaret Lowell paying H. Jenkins not out of neglect but out of necessity, outsourcing one form of care to preserve her capacity for another. She wrote of Eleanor Hayes pressing a violet between psalms on the day her mother died, not as grief alone, but as marking the transition from being a shepherd to someone else's needs to finally reclaiming a piece of earth for herself. She wrote of Abigail Poole's letters never delivered, her warning across a century to guard a piece of yourself for yourself always. And she wrote, with careful anonymity, of the young woman on the bus bench, of Martha the cashier with trembling hands, of all the contemporary women walking the same path of invisible devotion. She did not write of herself. Not directly. But her own story seeped into the narrative like groundwater rising through soil, present in every sentence about exhaustion that was not weakness but the inevitable result of systems demanding endless giving without replenishment, present in every observation about how families simplify narratives of survival to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about who actually held them together. Her voice became the chorus beneath the individual stories, a harmony of understanding that could only come from lived experience. One afternoon in late April, as cherry blossoms drifted past the archive's windows like pink snow, Mark called. His voice carried an unusual hesitancy. "I'm going to be in town next week for a conference," he said. "Thought I'd stop by. See your place. Maybe take you to dinner." Alara felt the old reflexes stir, the impulse to prepare, to perform wellness, to shield him from the messy reality of her grief. But something had shifted. She simply said, "I'd like that," and gave him her address. He arrived on a Thursday evening, his rental car pulling up to her modest apartment building with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged to a different world, one of airports and hotel loyalty programs and expense accounts. He looked older than she remembered, lines etched deeper around his eyes, his hair more gray than brown. The cheerful obliviousness she'd come to expect was tempered by something new, a wariness as if he'd begun to suspect the surface of their family narrative might conceal depths he wasn't equipped to navigate. She made tea. Real tea this time, not as time filler but as ritual, and they sat at her small table by the window, the cherry blossoms visible in the gathering dusk. For 20 minutes they spoke of safe things. His children's accomplishments, his wife's new job, the conference he was attending. Then, as if unable to bear the lightness any longer, he set down his cup and looked directly at her. "I had lunch with Mom's old neighbor Mrs. Gable last time I was here," he said. "She asked about you. Said she'd seen you at some historical society event." Alara nodded. "I volunteer there. A few days a week." Mark studied his hands, those hands that had held their mothers only during brief holiday visits. She said, "You've been doing important work. Preserving things." He paused, searching for words. "I guess I just assumed you'd be, I don't know, traveling, dating, starting over like we talked about." The phrase "starting over" hung between them, its inadequacy suddenly stark. You cannot start over when your entire adult identity has been forged in the fire of another's decline. You can only integrate. Rebuild on the same foundation, acknowledging the cracks as part of the structure rather than flaws to be hidden. "I am starting over," Alara said gently. "Just not in the way you imagined. I'm learning who I am after giving everything. It's slower work than travel brochures suggest." Mark looked out the window at the cherry blossoms, their petals catching the last light. "I don't know how you did it," he admitted, his voice barely audible. All those years. I visited when I could, but even during those visits, I'd leave feeling drained. And you were there every day. For 17 years. He turned back to her, his eyes glistening. I don't think I ever really understood what that cost you. The words were not an apology, they lacked the specificity required for true contrition, but they were an acknowledgement. And after months of casual erasure, even this partial seeing felt like rain after drought. I didn't do it for gratitude, Ilara said, surprising herself with the clarity of her own voice. I did it because she was my mother. Because someone had to. But understanding the cost matters. Not for me, though it helps, but because if we don't acknowledge the true cost of care, we'll keep expecting women to pay it without question. We'll keep forgetting the givers while celebrating the survival of the given to. Mark was silent for a long moment. Then, I told my daughter last week that Aunt Ilara took care of Grandma for 17 years. Not helped. Not pitched in. 17 years. She asked why I never did that. I didn't have a good answer. The honesty of his admission hung in the room, fragile but real. Ilara reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. The first time she'd initiated physical contact with him since their mother's funeral. You built a life, she said. I built a different kind of life. Neither is better. But only one gets remembered. He squeezed her hand, his grip firm with unspoken emotion. They sat like that until the light faded completely and the street lamps cast long shadows across the floor. When he left an hour later, he hugged her tightly at the door. I'm proud of you, Lara, he whispered, using the childhood nickname that now carried the weight of hard-won understanding rather than casual dismissal. And for the first time the words didn't feel like erasure. They felt like an offering, imperfect, incomplete, but genuine. The next morning, Ilara walked to the archives earlier than usual, the dawn air crisp with the promise of warmth to come. She found Agnes already there, carefully unboxing a new donation, a collection of diaries from a local convent where nuns had cared for orphans and the elderly poor throughout the 20th century. As Ilara slipped on her cotton gloves and began sorting the fragile books by date, she felt a quiet certainty settling in her chest. Mark's partial understanding had not healed the wound of being forgotten. Nothing could. But it had loosened its grip just enough to allow new growth. She no longer needed his full recognition to validate her sacrifice. She had built her own validation, not in external approval but in the daily practice of witness. Weeks passed. Ilara continued her work with Dr. Chin, exchanging emails and scanned documents, slowly shaping her private ledger into a chapter for the upcoming book. She also began a new project at the archives, one Agnes had suggested but left entirely to Ilara's design, an exhibit titled The Architecture of Care. Not a celebration of sacrifice, but an honest exploration of its contours, the physical toll on caregivers' bodies, the emotional erosion of self, the economic consequences of leaving the workforce to provide unpaid labor, the particular burden placed on daughters versus sons. She gathered artifacts to tell the story. A pill organizer worn smooth by 17 years of daily use, her own, anonymously donated, a pair of shoes with soles worn thin from pacing hospital corridors, a ledger showing the financial cost of medications not covered by insurance, letters from women describing the moment they realized they had disappeared into the role of caregiver. The exhibit opened on the first day of June. The Historical Society expected a modest turnout, perhaps 20 people, mostly elderly locals with an interest in town history. But when Ilara arrived that evening to help Agnes set up refreshments, she found a line stretching down the block. The local newspaper had run a small feature about the exhibit after a reporter visited during installation and was moved by what she saw. Word had spread. Not through social media algorithms or marketing campaigns, but through the oldest form of communication. Women telling women. Inside the exhibit hall, the air hummed with a particular quality of attention. The focused silence of people seeing their own lives reflected back at them for the first time. Ilara moved through the crowd unnoticed, watching faces as they paused before each display. She saw a woman in her 60s stand for 10 minutes before the pill organizer display, tears streaming silently down her face before she reached out and touched the glass case as if blessing it. She saw a young man read Abigail Poole's letter and then pull out his phone, thumb hovering over a contact labeled Mom, before typing a message Ilara couldn't see but somehow knew contained the words, I love you, and are you okay? She saw 3 generations of women, grandmother, mother, daughter, standing together before the final panel which read simply, they gave everything. The world forgot them. But we remember. After the official opening remarks, as people began to mingle with glasses of wine and plates of finger food, a woman approached Ilara. She was perhaps 50, with kind eyes and hands that bore the subtle marks of manual labor, thickened knuckles, a faint scar across the left thumb. "I don't know who organized this," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "but I needed to find you. To say thank you." She paused, gathering courage. "I've been caring for my mother with Alzheimer's for 8 years. My brother sends money sometimes. My sister visits at Christmas. But I'm the one who's there. Every day. And sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing. Like no one sees the cost. Like when she's gone, everyone will just say, 'She had a good death,' and forget that I gave up everything to make it possible." She reached out and took Ilara's hands in hers. "This exhibit, it's the first time I felt seen. Not pitied. Not admired. Just seen." Ilara looked into the woman's eyes and saw her own reflection, not as she was now, but as she had been during the darkest years of her mother's decline. The exhaustion. The isolation. The quiet terror of vanishing while still alive. She squeezed the woman's hands. "Your sacrifice matters," she said softly. "Even if no one remembers it. Even if your mother doesn't remember you. The love was real. That's what endures." The woman nodded, tears spilling over. "I just needed to hear that." Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and volunteers began collecting empty glasses, Agnes found Ilara standing before the final panel of the exhibit. "You did it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You built the memorial they never gave us." Ilara shook her head slowly. "I didn't build it for us. I built it for her." She gestured toward the woman who had thanked her, now speaking animatedly with 2 other caregivers near the refreshment table. "And for the woman who'll come next year and the year after that. This isn't about being remembered. It's about ensuring the next woman knows she's not alone." Agnes studied her face in the soft gallery lighting. "You've integrated it," she said finally. "The sacrifice. The forgetting. You're not fighting either anymore." Ilara considered this. 4 months, she had wrestled with the injustice of her erasure, measuring her 17 years against the gratitude she'd received and finding the scales catastrophically unbalanced. Then she had moved to acceptance, not of the forgetting itself, but of its inevitability in a world not designed to honor invisible labor. But tonight, watching women connect across generations in this room she had helped create, she realized she had moved beyond even acceptance. She had transformed the pain into purpose. The forgetting had not been undone. Mark would still simplify their family narrative, her niece would still grow up with only vague impressions of her devotion, but its power to define her had dissolved. She was no longer the woman who gave everything and was forgotten. She was the woman who gave everything, was forgotten, and chose to build a bridge for others crossing the same chasm. On the last day of June, Ilara received a package from Dr. Chin. Inside was an advance copy of the book, The Unseen Architecture, Women's Labor and the Hidden Foundations of Modern Life, with a handwritten note. "Your chapter is the heart of this book. Thank you for trusting me with these stories. They will reach thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. You have ensured these women will not be forgotten twice." Ilara held the book in her hands, its weight substantial and real. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she walked to her windowsill and picked up the wooden bird her mother had carved so many years ago. In the afternoon light, its painted eyes seemed to hold a new knowing, not the innocent joy of its creation, but the weathered wisdom of survival. She thought of all the women whose stories now lived between the covers of this book. Abigail Poole warning her daughter across a century to guard a piece of herself. Eleanor Hayes pressing a violet between psalms on the day her mother died. Margaret Lowell outsourcing care not from neglect but from necessity. Clara Mitchell holding open doors for mill workers' children in a town that would name its library after a mayor. And her own mother, vibrant and whole in early photographs, fading gradually like a photograph left in the sun, until only the love remained, pure and unadorned. She thought of the young woman on the bus bench, of Martha the cashier, of the woman who had thanked her at the exhibit, contemporary carriers of the same torch, walking the same path of invisible devotion. They would likely be forgotten too. Their sacrifices would be absorbed into smooth family narratives of resilience and survival. Their names would vanish from memory within a generation. This was the natural order of things. The slow erosion of detail, the simplification of complex histories into manageable stories. But they would not be forgotten twice. Not while books like this existed. Not while exhibits like hers remained in historical societies. Not while women like her continued the quiet work of witness. The first forgetting was inevitable, the natural decay of memory. But the second forgetting, the deliberate erasure, the refusal to acknowledge the cost, this they could fight. Not with monuments or speeches but with truth. With stories. with the stubborn insistence that love that consumes the giver is still love, that sacrifice that goes unrecognized is still sacrifice, that devotion that vanishes from memory was still real while it lasted. She opened the book finally, turning to her chapter. The title she had chosen appeared in elegant typeface, The Geometry of Devotion, When Giving Everything Becomes a Form of Disappearance. She read the first paragraph aloud to the empty room, her voice steady and clear. We measure sacrifice in grand gestures, the soldier falling on a grenade, the firefighter entering a burning building, the donor giving a kidney to a stranger. But the most common form of sacrifice happens quietly in ordinary homes. The daughter who gives up her career to bathe her mother, the wife who skips meals so her children can eat seconds, the sister who becomes a parent to siblings after tragedy strikes. These sacrifices are not celebrated. They are expected. And because they are expected, they are forgotten. The recipient survives, the family holds together, and the giver vanishes into the smooth narrative of resilience, as if survival were inevitable rather than purchased daily with pieces of a soul. This is the geometry of devotion. The more completely you give yourself away, the more completely you disappear from the story of what you saved. She closed the book and placed it on her nightstand beside the wooden bird. Outside her window, the world continued, people walking dogs, cars moving through streets, children laughing in the park. Lives being lived. She no longer watched them with detached curiosity. She watched them with compassion, the hard-won understanding that every person carried invisible weights, that every cheerful face might conceal a private erosion, that the woman buying groceries might be counting pennies after paying for her father's medication, that the man laughing on his phone might be hiding grief behind humor. She had given everything. They had forgotten her. But in the forgetting, she had discovered something the world could not take from her. The capacity to witness without needing to be witnessed in return. To love without requiring love's echo. To build memorials for others when no one would build one for her. This was not martyrdom. It was maturity. Not the bitter resignation of, this is just how it is, but the clear-eyed wisdom of, this is how it is, and I choose to respond with creation rather than resentment. That evening she walked to the park and sat on the same bench where she had wept months earlier. The pond was alive with ducks and dragonflies, the air warm with the scent of cut grass and blooming lilacs. An elderly man sat nearby feeding pigeons, his movements slow and deliberate. After a time he turned to her. Beautiful evening, he said. It is, she agreed. He studied her face for a moment, not with pity or curiosity, but with the quiet recognition of one survivor to another. You look like you've carried heavy things, he said finally. But you've set them down. Elara considered this. She hadn't set down the memory of her 17 years. She hadn't set down the grief of her mother's decline or the pain of being forgotten. But she had set down the expectation that her sacrifice required recognition to be valid. She had set down the burden of waiting for others to see her. And in setting down that particular weight, she had discovered she could still stand, perhaps not as tall as she once had, but with a different kind of strength, the strength of roots that have grown deep in difficult soil. Yes, she said softly. I've set some things down. The man nodded, satisfied, and returned to his feeding of pigeons. They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. And Elara understood at last the final truth of her journey, that to give everything is not to lose yourself, but to discover what remains when all the superficial layers have been stripped away. Not ambition. Not recognition. Not even memory. But love itself. Pure, unadorned, unbreakable love that continues to exist simply because it was real. And love, once given, can never truly be taken back. It simply changes form, becoming memory, becoming witness, becoming the quiet force that holds up the world when no one is watching. She rose as dusk settled, her body moving with a grace she hadn't felt in years. Walking home, she passed the Historical Society building, its windows dark now but holding within them the stories of unseen women. She thought of the exhibit still on display, of the women who would visit tomorrow and find themselves reflected there. She thought of Dr. Chen's book traveling to libraries and classrooms, carrying these stories beyond the town where they had been lived. She thought of the young woman on the bus bench, wherever she was tonight, perhaps still caring for her mother, perhaps feeling alone in her exhaustion, but now, because of this work, carrying the faint possibility that somewhere, someone understood. She reached her apartment and climbed the stairs to her door. Inside, she lit a single candle and placed it on the windowsill beside the wooden bird. The flame danced gently, casting shadows that moved like memories across the walls. She did not pray, not in any traditional sense. But she bore witness to her mother. To all the women who had given everything and been forgotten. To herself, to the girl with sunflowers on her fire escape, to the woman who had held a trembling body through night terrors, to the survivor who had learned to build beauty from ashes. The forgetting would continue. Mark would tell simplified stories. Her niece would grow up with vague impressions. The new owners of her childhood home would paint over history. This was the natural order of things. But Alara would remember. And in remembering she would preserve. And in preserving she would ensure that no act of love, however invisible, however unacknowledged, would vanish completely from the earth. She blew out the candle, leaving only moonlight to fill the room. And as she lay down to sleep, she felt not the crushing weight of erasure, but the quiet power of continuity, the understanding that she was both an end and a beginning, a witness and a bridge, a woman who had given everything and in doing so had discovered that the most enduring form of immortality is not being remembered, but remembering others. She had given everything. They had forgotten her. But the love remained. And love, once given, becomes part of the fabric of the world, woven into its bones, humming in its blood, waiting patiently for the next witness to recognize its shape. And that was enough. It had always been enough. It would always be enough.